study, and specifically the Pantops study area. And we'll get into the presentation in a minute. We are recording this presentation for anybody that would like to rewatch it, or for anyone who couldn't make it to the meeting tonight and would like to try to watch it later. We'll begin with some introductions. So my name is Boris Palchik, and I'm the project manager for this project. I'm with a company called Foursquare Integrated Transportation Planning. We are one of two firms that is working on this project along with Michael Baker. There's a few of my colleagues on this call as well. Laura Duke and Jeremy Strauss both work with me. We also have a few folks from the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission, including Jessica Bollering. So Jessica, maybe you want to introduce folks on your team?
Sure, thanks, Boris. Yeah, hi, I'm Jessica Hirsch-Ballering. I'm a transportation planner at the TJPDC working on this project. We also have Sandy Shackelford, if you want to wave, and Lucinda Shannon.
Okay, very good. So we don't have a ton of people yet on the call, so I thought maybe we could have the folks that are on the call introduce themselves and tell us where you live or what your interest or affiliation is with the Pantops area. Maybe let's see. Oh, let's see. Kevin, did I miss you?
Yeah, I'm here. Kevin McDermott, Albemarle County Planning Manager, and I run the transportation programs here at Albemarle County.
Okay, great. How about Richard? You want to introduce?
Hi, I'm Richard Kiss. I live at Westminster, Canterbury, the Blue Ridge. I'm chairman of the Pantops CAC.
Okay, thanks for joining us. John?
Yeah, hi, good evening. John Kowaleski. I'm the Vice President of Operations at Westminster, Canterbury, the Blue Ridge. So very interested in what you have to present this evening. Thank you.
Great. And Kenneth? Okay, well, maybe Kenneth's not on. Okay, we'll just get started. So a little bit of an introduction first about this project. What we're working on is a feasibility study and an implementation plan for expanding transit service in population and employment centers within Albemarle County. We're looking in particular at three specific areas: the Pantops area, the Monticello area, and then also the US 29 corridor. When we look at these areas, we're not limiting ourselves to the types of services that currently exist in those study areas. So the Pantops area, for example, is served both by CAT fixed route service and by jaunt service, both fixed route and demand response. But we'll be looking at a range of different service options, including some innovative types of transportation solutions that we'll be talking about later in the presentation. So our approach to this project is really to look at three key data sets. One is a data set looking at the market that transit operates in. Another is looking at the service that exists today. And then a third is reaching out to stakeholders like all of you in order to get input on the strengths and weaknesses of the existing service and how you'd like to see things improved going forward. So good data is really important for us as a team, as a consulting team, to understand what's happening today. And so we'll be relying on all three of these data sets to really give us a complete picture of both the existing situation and opportunities moving forward. So the Pantops area is shown here, this kind of pinkish purplish blob on this map. The boundaries, the approximate boundaries are the Ravenna River on the west, I-64 to the south, and the Fontana neighborhood to the northeast. This area includes two major arterial roads. So you have US Highway 250 as well as Virginia 20, which kind of, well, one bisects the area and the other one cuts through it as well. It's an area that has quite a few important regional destinations. So you have the Pantops Shopping Center, which is a major retail center, the Ravenna Ridge Shopping Center, as well as Martha Jefferson Hospital, the VA Clinic, and the Social Security Administration building. All of those are within our study area. There are a few different transit services, as I mentioned, that currently operate within this study area. So you have CAT Route 10, which is shown in this kind of light blue or bright blue, I guess you could say, line. And then there's a service operated by Jaunt called the Buckingham Connect East Route. And we'll talk a bit more about both of these as we go through this presentation. So the reason that we are interested in understanding the market is because there are many different ways that transit service can be provided in this study area or in any study area. And each of those services has their own ideal operating environments. So we want to understand what is the environment that we have to work with in each of the areas that we're looking at. This illustration here shows that as an area has more density, there are more types of transit service that can be considered for that area and that will be viable in that area. Lower density areas cannot support some of the transit services listed in this table. So for example, lower density areas wouldn't be expected to support high frequency, high capacity transit service, but maybe they could support things like commuter services, shared mobility type of services. So the metrics that we are looking to understand in the study area are things like density, demographics, land use, and the built environment. So we'll talk through those one at a time. So we'll start with density. So the way that we look at density is looking at something that we call transit potential. And transit potential is a measure both of population and employment density in an area. So this map is showing a color-coded representation of transit potential. So areas that are yellow, orange, or red have higher transit potential because they have higher density, both of people and jobs, and then areas that are gray or green have lower density. Now, in the Pantops area, north of 250, there are a number of key kind of activity generators like multifamily housing, like the Social Security Administration building, but it's still showing fairly low density. And the reason for that is because the geographies that we are doing this analysis on are called census block groups. And census block groups tend to get bigger as you move away from an urbanized area. And in some cases, the area of the census block group is so large that it kind of dilutes any density of activity because you're sort of dividing over a very large area. And so we aren't only looking at density, we're also looking at the presence of key activity generators, which on this map are shown as points of interest. So there are specific points of interest that we look at because they tend to be good predictors of where transit trips are going to materialize. So that includes shopping, large retail centers, educational facilities, medical facilities, multifamily housing, which could mean apartment complexes, condominiums, mobile home communities. All of those are what we consider multifamily housing. And then community centers, and that's kind of a broad category that includes like the Social Security Administration, things like YMCAs, libraries, and the like, where people tend to congregate in a community. So fixed route transit service does require a sort of minimum density to be effective. So as a rule of thumb, we try to look for densities above 5 people or jobs per acre for fixed route service. Areas that have lower density than that, and by the way, more than 5 people or jobs per acre is the yellow area. So yellow, orange, and red is that higher density area. If you have densities below that, you can still plan for transit service, but not necessarily fixed route transit service. You're more in the range of what's called demand response transit service. And we'll talk about that in a second as well. So in the Pantops study area in particular, we do see the moderate transit potential south of Richmond Road. That's the 250 corridor. The higher transit potential is driven primarily in this area by relatively high employment density. So you have retail employment, medical employment, community services, and the like. On the north side of 250, you have a lot more residential density, but on the south, you have a lot of kind of employment density. There's when we look at the market analysis, we look at transit potential, which is telling us where transit has the strongest likelihood of being effective. We also look at a measure called transit need. So transit need is where we would expect there to be a elevated need for transit service. And this map actually is showing the wrong this is the wrong map. I apologize. I'll have to come back to this, but essentially transit need is looking at where you have concentrations of specific population subgroups, including zero vehicle households, low income populations, persons with disabilities, older adults, and then youth and young adults. These are the population subgroups that tend to have a high propensity to use transit. So transit need is a relative measure. We try to understand where in the study area there's a higher transit need and where there may be a lower transit need. But transit need and transit potential have to work well together, because you could have a situation where you have a relatively high transit need because, for example, you might have a mobile home park where you have an older population group and there may be a higher need for transit, but the overall density in the area may be low. The overall population employment density in the area may be low, and so for that reason, fixed route service still may not work in that kind of environment. We saw that in the Pantops area, the overall transit need was relatively low compared to nearby areas. However, there are some areas that are important regional destinations that may drive transit activity. Even if the residential transit need is fairly low, there are people going to the Pantops area for key services like the Martha Jefferson Hospital, like the Social Security Administration, like the VA clinic. So there's still a need for connections to the Pantops area, even if it's not being driven by the local residential density. So I know that's kind of a lot. So I'm going to just pause there for a second to see if there's any questions. Okay. Yes, Richard.
Have you considered the changes that we see coming in the Pantops area, such as the motor vehicle department going somewhere? That building's had a sign on it for years saying it's moving. The status of State Farm with their employees, whether they're working remote or whether they're coming back to their large building. They're one of the largest employers here, along with obviously the hospital and then Westminster Canterbury. So I don't know whether your study takes into account those future moves or whether you're just concentrating on today's situation.
Yeah, well, we are trying to keep track of new developments like the ones that you've described. One way that we're doing that is through these meetings. So people are pointing our attention to some of these changes that are coming down the line. So we'll make note of the ones that you mentioned. And if there's any others that anybody knows of, then we'll certainly take those into account as well. So, and that kind of brings up in a kind of an important point, which is that land use in the built environment, which could include new employers and how they're building their offices, where they're building their offices, kind of the layout of new developments. Those are important in supporting transit as well. As I mentioned earlier, we know that certain land uses tend to generate higher percentage of transit trips than other land uses. So multifamily housing tends to generate transit at a higher rate than single family housing because you have that density and other socioeconomic characteristics. Medical facilities and educational facilities also, retail centers, major employers, all those are the types of land uses that we look for in trying to identify where transit has the greatest likelihood of succeeding. Fixed route service also requires a supportive pedestrian environment to be most effective, because fixed route service means people need to come out to a bus stop or a station in order to access the service. So we take into account where there are sidewalks, where there are crosswalks, where there's a good grid network of streets that could support fixed route service. Now those elements don't exist everywhere within every community, and so that's why fixed route service may not be the best solution in every part of every community. Areas that lack the characteristics to support fixed route transit service may be good candidates for what's called demand response service. So demand response service is a type of transit service where, as the name suggests, it comes to people on demand. there have been a lot of developments over the past couple of years with this type of transit service in particular, as technology has kind of caught up to, or I guess as the mode has caught up to technology, and there are now applications of the type of technology that people may be familiar with Uber and Lyft in demand response service. And this type of service is called microtransit. So microtransit is a technology-driven approach to demand response service for public transportation purposes. So the main difference between microtransit and Uber and Lyft is that Uber and Lyft operate with a fleet of vehicles that they're not infinite, but you never quite know what kind of vehicle you're going to get when you request a service. Whereas with microtransit, you have a set fleet of vehicles and a set group of drivers that are operating the service, so it's more predictable and can be more closely branded with public transportation, the local public transportation service, and kind of more closely affiliated with it. So microtransit is a tool that is very useful in automobile-oriented environments or other environments that lack either the density or the pedestrian characteristics needed to support fixed route transit service. So this is something that we'll be looking at throughout the area. So that's what we were talking about up to now has been the market analysis. Now we'll shift to discussing the service analysis. So the service analysis is looking at the existing services and how they're working today. We're trying to understand what the strengths and weaknesses are of each CAT and John service in each of the study areas. So here we're looking at CAT Route 10 and John's Buckingham Connect East service. The map on the right is actually showing the demand response. It's a ridership heat map of just demand response service that Jaunt is operating within the Pantops area. And so that includes things like paratransit service. So paratransit is a demand response service that is available for people with disabilities. And it also includes a few additional Jaunt demand response services. So it's important for us to understand the service analysis, but it's also important for us to understand in the context of the market analysis. Where we see lower ridership, for example, we may refer back to the market analysis and try to understand, well, why isn't there more ridership in a particular area? And this kind of helps illustrate that point. So this map is showing, again, that transit potential. So we would expect more ridership south of US 250. And in fact, we're seeing the ridership heat map show us that on the demand response side, at least, the ridership is concentrated where we see the greatest potential for ridership. So that kind of helps us validate and verify the market analysis. Now, the reason it's important for us to validate the market analysis is because right now, because of COVID, we're seeing a lot less ridership than we typically would see on all transit services. So this first map is showing kind of a pre-COVID ridership heat map for demand response service in the study area. This is showing a current ridership heat map of the same area. So since the ridership is so much lower, it doesn't tell us a lot of information. So we can refer to the market analysis to kind of lead the way and tell us where we would expect to see ridership going forward. Okay. So one of the routes that is currently operating in the study area is the Route 10, the CAT Route 110. So these two maps show the eastbound and westbound ridership on Route 10 before COVID. So the way that Route 10 operates, it goes into the Pantops shopping center, which is, you see this kind of red dot here, then goes out to Martha Jefferson Hospital, the Social Security Administration building, and then it comes up Stony Point Road and then back toward Charlottesville. So the key destinations that are served by Route 10 are the Pantops Shopping Center, Ravenna Ridge Shopping Center, the DMV, which, as Richard mentioned, may be moving, the Martha Jefferson Hospital, the VA Clinic, and the Social Security Administration building. So again, the reason these are split into two is because Martha Jefferson Hospital is sort of the turning point between the trips that are designated as outbound or eastbound and trips that are designated as inbound or westbound. So you see the ridership on one map of buses going out toward Martha Jefferson, and the ridership on the other map of buses going from Martha Jefferson toward Charlottesville. So this is pre-pandemic. Oops, wrong direction. This is post-pandemic. So these maps, you'll see the ridership has declined at most stops, but there are still some important ridership destinations where ridership is still fairly high, like the Pantops Shopping Center and like Martha Jefferson Hospital. And then one in particular that kind of caught our attention was this stop here, which is on Stony Point Road. And it's sort of, it was a bit of a mystery why the ridership is so high there, until we kind of realized that because of the design of Route 10, people heading outbound or eastbound can get to the Pantops Shopping Center, but the bus does not return there. So if they want to, if they're coming from Charlottesville, they can go to the shopping center, and then their choices are, when they're done shopping, to get on the bus and head out of direction toward Martha Jefferson Hospital before they're finally able to return back, or to cross 250 and pick up the bus essentially here across from the shopping center. And it looks like that's what people seem to be doing rather than riding out of direction. So that's one of the issues that we identified. We tried for every route, as we were looking at the routes serving each study area, we tried to identify potential issues on, why the route may not be doing as well as it could, and find ways to address that. So the service to the Pantops Shopping Center in Stony Point being provided in only one direction is one of those issues. And just in general, there's a large one-way loop through the Pantops area, and that is something that limits the appeal of the service, because people do end up having to ride out of direction, either outbound or inbound. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Okay, so as it turns out, though, CAT has some plans to address the issues I just mentioned. They're currently going through the process of service changes now. They've been having public meetings to present ideas for some service changes. The meetings have been going on this month, and I believe last month as well. So Route 10 in particular, the changes there are to eliminate the Stony Point segment of the route and instead operate to the Social Security Administration, and then turn back around and come back along the same alignment. So people going to Pantops Shopping Center would have service in both directions. Same thing goes for people at the hospital. So from Charlottesville, people would ride out to the hospital, to the Social Security, and then right back the way they came. So that's an improvement in our view, and that's what's being planned for the near future by CAT. The frequency of the service is also is going to be 30 minutes, or that's what's proposed. Currently, it's operating with 60-minute headways. That's a reduction from the previous way this route operated. It's a reduction because of COVID, but there are plans to increase weekday service to 30-minute service, and then continue to operate hourly on weekends. Okay. The other service that is operating in the Pantops area is the Jaunt Buckingham Connect East route. So this service operates between Buckingham County and destinations in Charlottesville and Albemarle County. Those destinations include downtown Charlottesville, the University Hospital, Martha Jefferson Hospital, and then Westminster Canterbury Retirement Community. This is very much a commuter-focused service. It only operates one morning trip and one afternoon trip. So the morning trip is to the Pantops area, and the afternoon trip is from the Pantops area back out to Buckingham County. We don't have the detailed ridership information from this service, but again, it's operating really just as a commuter service, once in the morning and once in the afternoon. Any questions on that? No? Okay. So the next part of our discussion tonight, I'm going to be putting some questions up on the screen that I would like anybody who's on the meeting to address. We want to understand your thoughts about transit and how it can be improved. So the first question is, are there any current CAT or jaunt routes that you may be familiar with that you think should be changed? And if so, how would you improve them? And if nobody has any thoughts on that, or if you want to think about it some more, we can go on to the next question, and then any of these are fair game at any point. So are there parts of the study area that you think are not currently served that you think need to be served by public transportation? Okay. The next question is, for areas that may not be served today, if any of those areas are sort of regionally critical areas, how are people getting there today? Are people finding a way other than transit to get out to some areas that may not have great service, other than driving? For example, are people getting rides from friends, neighbors, churches? Are they participating in van pools or car pools? Okay, so another question is, are there any other issues other than the design of the routes that may be barriers to transit use in the Pantops area? So that refers to things like schedules, fares, amenities, anything that you think may be preventing folks from either accessing transit or considering it a viable option. And Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Boris. A couple things I was going to ask about this, and this pertains to all studies, I guess, not just this one, the Pantops ones. One thing that I wonder about is if I think the CAT system assumes that the destination for every rider is the downtown area, or if not, they have to transfer. And I know that probably expands the study that you're looking at or the way you're evaluating this, but wonder if some consideration or discussion with CAT should take place that would say maybe some routes, not all routes have to go just to downtown and then go right back out, so that you could have another destination beyond downtown and put multiple buses in service at the time, or mix some of the other lines together, so that every person doesn't have to go to downtown and transfer. Is that something that you guys would consider?
Yeah, it's a really good point you bring up. There are two main ways to design a fixed route transit network. One is a hub and spoke network, and the other is what's called a grid network. The challenge with a grid network is that for it to work well, you have to have very high frequency on essentially all the routes, because you don't with a hub and spoke, you can try to time schedules so that the buses meet up in a central hub like downtown Charlottesville. In a grid system where you have a lot of more direct trips, buses sort of just meet up where they meet up, because it's impossible to time it in such a way that every bus meets every other bus. So the way to get around that is to have very high service frequency, because that way, if you get off a bus, there will be another one coming within, let's say, 15 minutes. It's not a big deal. You wait, at the corner, and another bus will come along. That's a model that's used in places like Chicago, for example. They have a grid system, and they are able to maintain fairly high service frequency. In most communities, it's very difficult financially to support that high frequency service, and that's why the preference has been historically more of a hub and spoke model. However, now with things like microtransit, which we just talked about earlier, you have a different model altogether that you can consider that is point to point. It's point to point within a specific area within a specific zone, but it is point to point. And so the trick with microtransit service is to draw the zone in a way that it encompasses enough variety of origins and destinations that people can sort of make their day just within that zone. So, for example, you want to make sure that a zone includes residential areas plus grocery stores plus maybe schools, educational facilities, so people can use the microtransit service for local circulation, but then also connect to the regional transit network at designated stops for even more destinations they can access. So that's maybe a very long-winded response to your question, but hopefully it gets at some of what you were asking about.
Yeah, it definitely does, and I can understand your point, and it is valid. But I guess the other option that I see, and I have noticed this in other towns, is that obviously the downtown would be is the center of our region, really. But in, say, like Route 10, if instead of going downtown, turning around and coming back, if it stops downtown, but then continues on heading west and also stops at UVA and then goes back and makes the same, so it crosses through that center, but doesn't actually turn around and come back to reduce the transfer and that need to have to get off a bus and possibly wait for another bus.
Okay, that's a really good point as well. I'm going to bring up the system map so we can speak to that. Well, I only have part of a system map, but you can kind of see downtown here. So what you're describing is sometimes it's called through routing, sometimes it's called interlining. And what it means is that, as you describe, you could have a bus that goes downtown, but then continues through, that same vehicle continues through. That allows people to have the benefit of what's called a one-seat ride. So they don't have to get off a vehicle, even if it does hit the hub, it goes through. Typically, when you do that, that bus, even if it continues through, will probably change its head sign once it gets downtown. And the reason head sign is the destination sign. And the reason that's important is that if you have an area like downtown Charlottesville where you have a massive amount of turnover, like new people are joining the trip, new people are getting on, getting off, you wouldn't want a bus that's labeled Route 10 that serves kind of the east side of the community, and also Route 10 that serves the west side of the community, because you don't want to risk a person accidentally getting on the wrong Route 10. People that are in a hurry, they might see the 10 and they might not read the rest, the fine print, they get on the wrong bus and end up in the complete opposite side of town. So what interlining does is you have on paper, two different routes, but behind the scenes, operationally, it's just one vehicle or one group of vehicles that are performing that service as sort of a circuit. And if you can publish that on passenger schedules, let's say if you pick up a passenger schedule and you look at Route 10, it might have at the end of the schedule, it'll say this bus continues on to UVA, and people know that they can stay on the bus to continue to UVA, but it might be called Route 20 instead of Route 10 as it continues out.
Thanks.
Sure. Lucinda.
I'm unmuted. I just wanted to say, like, one of the barriers that I see in that area is it's not really hospitable to walking. It's difficult to cross 250, but even if you're staying on one side of the road, the shopping centers are large. They've got big parking lots, and to try to get from one shopping center to another, sometimes there's not a pedestrian pathway, and it's difficult to cross even those side roads.
Yeah, that's certainly the case, and that's why it's kind of exciting that now we have more tools to work with, things like microtransit that didn't even exist 5 years ago, because those modes in many cases are just much more conducive to the built environment that they have to operate in. I mean, there's only so much we can do about changing the environment. We can, develop recommendations to improve the pedestrian infrastructure and so on, and maybe that'll happen over time. But in the immediate environment, you can implement a microtransit service which can really do well in an environment like you're describing, because it provides the more curb-to-curb service versus requiring people to make their way to a bus stop. Okay, let's go back to the question slide.
And can I build on that too? Also, I think Lucinda makes a good point, and it actually strikes me now that I'm thinking about that when we looked at the different the eastbound westbound ridership levels that you had, and you pointed out that one that stop on the other side of 250 was seen, I think you said that's westbound. Everybody westbound gets on at that one because they don't have a direct route if they get on at the same stop they got off eastbound. But
Right.
currently we have no pedestrian crosswalk at that intersection of 250 and what is Stony Point or Route 20 right there. So it surprises me that many people are willing to cross what is a really difficult crossing to
Yeah,
get to that other stop.
right. So I'm just bringing it up here. So that'll be this intersection here. And you are right. There's a pedestrian right there. So people, even in this photo, there's a pedestrian. So people are somehow navigating this. It may not be pretty, but people are somehow doing it. I think there's a shopping cart right there. So people are taking their carts as far as they can, and then they run across however they can. And yeah, that's how it is. I think that, we were looking, if you look at this area, there's some medical office buildings here that there just doesn't seem to be anything here that really would justify this higher ridership, other than the fact that the buses come here, but then they don't go back. Even if a person doesn't want to do this, if they happen to miss, so let's say they're shopping, they may be done with their shopping and they may have just missed a bus. If this bus is running hourly, they're going to make their way across the street, because to get the next bus, that's convenient from here, they have to wait a long time. Plus they have to ride all the way out to Martha Jefferson Hospital before they can head back. So people do what they have to do.
Yeah, and we are, there is a project in design to add a pedestrian crosswalk there. It'll be a few more years, but that will be happening. And sorry, another, well, that's all I have for now. Thanks.
Okay.
So there is low income housing up Route 20 from there, and I see a lot of people walking on Route 20 back and forth.
Yep. There's a lot of multifamily housing in general, low income and not low income. There's a very large concentration of multifamily housing. The problem again is that if anyone lives in some of these apartment communities and they want to go home, if they work in Charlottesville, let's say, or at UVA, it's great. They have service, almost front door service, and then it heads straight out to downtown, and it's very convenient. On the way home, however, they have to ride all the way through here, all the way to Martha Jefferson Hospital, all of that before they can finally get home. So that's the problem. But again, this is something that CAT is addressing, but unfortunately the solution they came up with is to terminate the route at Social Security here. So the route will come into Pantops, turn around here, and then go back the way it came. So this whole area is being cut out. That's an area that, but again, could be a good candidate for microtransit service, at least in the short term, because over time, if it proves to be a strong ridership generator, that's another benefit of microtransit, is it allows you to sort of gauge the real market for an area before committing to fixed route service, which in many cases is more expensive to operate. So, or if microtransit were to be implemented in these neighborhoods that do have a more suburban type of land use, but then ridership does start materializing, you could then come back later and serve it with fixed route service.
This is Jeremy from Foursquare as well. I was going to ask a question, sort of, or prompt along those lines. If folks, on this call who actually live in that region, from either the planning commission staff or the general public who are here have any ideas about that area? Is it north of Richmond Road that CAT is proposing cutting? I'd just be interested to hear them, because it is, as Boris is saying, pretty suburban. You can see from this overhead that it's not exactly a grid network. Just if anyone has any sort of, based on your local knowledge of the area, what you think would be good to serve the Avemore apartments and the surroundings as well.
I'm not exactly sure which apartments you're talking about, but it looks like you could connect, well, like do a loop and, you know, go from the Social Security Center through the neighborhood to back, you know, and back around down Route 20 to 250. I don't
Something
know how.
like,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah. That is a possibility. That I think that you sort of run out of public roads at some point, because this, I think, is doable. I believe that's a private drive. Not sure you could make it through there, and then this road doesn't cut through. It's a challenging environment. I mean, this is it's not atypical of, you know, suburban land use, where you have kind of circuitous roadways that are meant to be traffic calming instruments, like to make sure that local traffic doesn't speed through here. But it does create a challenge for bus service. So one of the other questions, really the last question I had, is we've talked a little bit about on-demand service or demand response service or microtransit service. You can call it whatever you'd like. But do you think that the residents of the Pantops area or visitors of the Pantops area would see this as an upgrade or a downgrade of the traditional fixed route service?
I think that's a really difficult question, because we don't really know exactly what the on-demand service looks like. We know what the fixed route service currently is, but as far as like how the on-demand service would work, I'm not sure. And then, you know, there's the technology for people using transit, if, you know, they're adapting it or not.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Richard, go ahead.
Does the type of bus come into your consideration at all? It would seem to me that the on-demand service would be better served with a much smaller vehicle. And then the other question I have is the size of the buses you have now. What is the density in terms of passengers per bus? Are the buses too big? Are they just right? Are they too small?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, the demand response service or microtransit service comes in different shapes and sizes, everything ranging from kind of a souped up golf cart, which you see here, which is typically used in a very dense urban area for very short trips, up to what's called a cutaway bus. A cutaway bus is like what Jaunt operates today. It's kind of a van platform with a 12 to 16 passenger carrying capacity, or things like minivans or vans that maybe can carry 8 to 12 passengers. All of those can be applied to this microtransit service model. And so that's what we would expect to see, smaller vehicles in your typical 40-foot bus. As far as the CAT buses go, some of the services do quite well on certain trips, especially those that go through the university, you know, serve UVA or adjacent to UVA, at least when the university is in session. And you kind of have to design for the worst case scenario when it comes to buses, just like you do on a highway. You know, you may not need all 4 lanes or 5 lanes of a highway all the time, but during rush hour you do. And the same kind of goes for fixed route bus service. If when when UVA is in session, you have times of the day when there's a lot of turnover of students. You do tend to have, in some cases even standing loads, but that's definitely not the case throughout the day, and it's definitely not the case on all routes. I guess the takeaway, really, what I'm getting at is there's a time and a place for fixed route transit service, and historically, fixed route service was kind of one of the few tools that transit planners had to work with, but now there are more tools available to us, like microtransit, that can be equally appealing, but operate in a very, in a different environment and still be effective and efficient. And our challenge is to identify where we should recommend microtransit and where we should recommend fixed route service, or where we should recommend commuter type services like Jaunt operates. All of those have their place. We just need to understand where the place is for all of them. Okay, so that actually concludes my questions, and if there's anything else that is on anybody's mind about transit service in the Pantops area, please feel free to speak up. But that is the end of my questions to all of you.
I have one more. Sorry to just jump in. With the parts of the study area that are not currently served that should be. I bring this up because of the barrier at 250 and that CAT is not going to serve that area north of there anymore. That area north is getting a lot more of potential trip generation ongoing. Not only you can see, I mean, just in this aerial, you see the large area up to the north there that's under construction. That's mostly built now, but there are still homes going in there. The Riverside Village, which is the grid to the left of the current line there. Yeah, right where your cursor is now. That is continuing to develop, and that has both residential and some office space, a little bit of commercial. And then right there adjacent to 250, you see another large spot that's under construction in your aerial that is getting a lot of retail services put in. So whatever we're looking at now, I think we should be considering how it can be adaptable to serve those areas in the future, even if they're not fully, a generator right now. I think in the very near future they will be. So just another consideration to keep in mind.
Yeah, it may be that there's essentially one route serving this area now. That may just be, stretching this route too thin. It may be that two routes are going to be necessary. So we'll take a look. Richard, you had another question?
Yeah, the development people that talk to us about Pantops are talking about the substantial redevelopment of the Rivanna River Shopping Center. Apparently there's quite a bit of commercial interest there and also residential, I believe, in that area. So that could be a growth area.
Mm-hmm.
It's down here, I believe. Yeah, it's down here they're talking.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, it sounds like, I mean, this is the areas that we are focusing on in the study, Pantops area, the 29 North Corridor, those are growing areas in general with lots of development happening. So I think that is why they were selected, for this additional look at the mobility possibilities going forward. So yeah, there's a lot of development. All right. Well, great. So that, I think, concludes our discussion tonight. So thank you all for joining, and thanks for the insight and comments. I'll stay on for another couple of minutes if anybody wants to still chat, but otherwise, thank you all very much and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Boris.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Boris,
Mhm.